There is a particular kind of public moment that goes beyond news, beyond celebrity, beyond even the usual boundaries of royal coverage with all its pageantry and protocol and carefully managed imagery. It's the kind of moment that catches people by surprise with how much they feel it, that stops them mid-scroll or mid-conversation and produces something genuinely emotional in a world that has largely become very good at managing its own emotions at a careful, ironic distance. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has produced several of those moments over the past 18 months, but perhaps none of them captured the particular quality of what her return to public life has actually meant to the institution, to the public, and to the woman herself, as well as the image from the Italy trip in May of this year. A woman in a pale yellow dress standing in a preschool in Reggio Emilia in the north of Italy, surrounded by small children who had absolutely no idea who she was and consequently treated her with the completely unsentimental enthusiasm that small children reserve for adults who get down on the floor and engage with them properly. The smile on her face in those photographs was the kind that doesn't get arranged by a communications team. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely, simply happy to be there. And for anyone who had been watching the 18 months that preceded that moment, the months of gradual, careful, sometimes visibly effortful return to public life after a year of cancer treatment that she herself described as life-changing for anyone who goes through it, that image carried a weight that is genuinely difficult to put into words without sounding like an overstatement. It wasn't an overstatement, it was real. To understand fully what this return has actually been and what it has meant, you need to go back to the beginning of it, to January the 14th of 2025, which is the date that Kate Middleton Catherine, Princess of Wales, told the world she was in remission. The announcement came in the form she has chosen throughout her illness and recovery, a personal, handwritten statement posted on social media rather than a formal palace press release. A choice that itself said something about how deliberately she has managed the human dimensions of this very public-private experience. The language she used was characteristic, grateful, hopeful, cautious. She described herself as focused on recovery. She said she was looking forward to a fulfilling year ahead. And she said, in a phrase that resonated specifically with the hundreds of thousands of people who had been following her journey and who understood immediately what it cost to be able to say it, there is much to look forward to. Across Britain, across the Commonwealth, across every country where people had been watching and waiting and, in many cases, genuinely worrying about this particular woman in this particular situation, the reaction was immediate and enormous. The word remission carries a very specific kind of hope for anyone who has been anywhere near a cancer diagnosis, their own or a loved one's. It doesn't mean cured. It doesn't mean the danger is entirely past. But it means the hardest part of the immediate journey is over, that the body has responded well enough to treatment that the treatment itself can ease, and that ordinary life, with all its small textures and pleasures and demands, can begin to reassemble itself around you again. And that word, landing in January of 2025, after months of careful, limited, palace-managed communication about a diagnosis that had shaken the country in a way that surprised even experienced royal commentators, produced something that felt almost like a collective exhale. Then came the gradual, careful, entirely deliberate work of actually coming back. And this is the part of Kate's story that deserves the most attention, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world for the institution, for the communications machinery, and even for Kate herself to rush. The pressure to do so was real and visible. The monarchy was already navigating the overlapping crises of King Charles's own cancer treatment, the Andrew scandal, the Harry situation, the broader questions about the institution's long-term stability and public standing. Kate is, by the judgment of virtually every serious royal commentator who has looked at this honestly, the single most valuable asset the working royal family currently possesses. Hugo Vickers said it directly and memorably, stating that the monarchy urgently needs Catherine, that she is the jewel in the crown, in a way that is not simply affectionate hyperbole, but a genuine institutional assessment. Royal historian Amanda Foreman went further, calling her the MVP of the royal family. In that context, the temptation to bring her back quickly, fully, and visibly, to deploy her popular appeal, and her extraordinary connection with the public as a counterweight to the institution's other difficulties, must have been significant, and the fact that it was apparently resisted, that the decision was made to let her return on her own terms and at her own pace, with the palace announcing her engagements closer to the event than normal specifically to protect her flexibility and her well-being, is itself a small but telling marker of how seriously her recovery has been taken by the people around her. The numbers tell their own story about how careful that return actually was. In the whole of 2024, the year of her diagnosis, her surgery, and her chemotherapy, Kate completed just 13 royal engagements, 13 across an entire calendar year, for a woman who in normal years would complete well over 100. Those 13 appearances were chosen with the kind of precision that only makes sense when every outing represents a genuine expenditure of energy that is in limited supply. Appearances at the kind of ceremonies and commemorations, VE Day, Trooping the Color, the Christmas Day walkabout at Sandringham, where her absence would have been more visible and more damaging to the institution than her presence was difficult for her health. Then in 2025, across the year that followed her remission announcement, the number rose to 68, a five-fold increase from the year before, but still well below her pre-illness pace and still carefully selected according to a principle that the people around her have described in consistent terms. Royal biographer Robert Jobson, who has covered Kate's return more thoroughly than almost any other writer, put it most cleanly when he said that last year was survival then recovery mode, picking her moments and pacing herself, and that going forward, her diary would be filling up, but she wouldn't go back to the old pace because she'd learned that lesson. It will be meaningful, he said, with gaps in between for her family. That phrase, meaningful, is one that keeps recurring in everything written and said about Kate's approach to her return, and it points towards something genuinely significant about how her illness appears to have changed not just her schedule, but her whole orientation toward her role. The pre-illness Kate, for all her evident warmth and genuine commitment to her patronages and causes, operated within a framework that was, to some degree, dictated by the rhythms and requirements of the institutional machine. Engagements were arranged, outfits were selected and reported on in meticulous detail. Appearances were choreographed and photographed and consumed by a media culture that treated the Princess of Wales as a kind of living fashion event as much as a working royal. Kensington Palace's decision, taken as her comeback began, to stop routinely sharing details of her outfits during official engagements was noted by fashion director Bethan Holt as a signal of something real. She has an inner steel about what she wants, Holt said, and a drive that will be reflected in what she does and what she wears. That inner steel and that shift away from being primarily a subject of fashion coverage toward being primarily the person doing the work is one of the most quietly significant changes in how Kate's public identity has been repositioned in the period since her return. The early 2026 engagements, the ones that opened her first full year of post-remission public life, illustrated this new orientation with real clarity. In January, she hosted the England women's rugby team at Windsor Castle, celebrating their World Cup win from September of the previous year. The warmth of that occasion and the specific unscripted detail of Kate revealing that George, Charlotte, and Louis all play rugby at home that she doesn't want to get tackled by George because he's getting so strong, that she thinks schools shouldn't pigeonhole boys and girls in sports too early, was the kind of genuine, personal, warmly human communication that no media training produces, and that no communication strategy can manufacture. It either comes naturally or it doesn't. And in Kate's case, it has always come naturally, and the illness and recovery appear to have deepened rather than diminished that quality. Later in January, she traveled to the north of England for a trio of engagements specifically chosen to reflect the healing power of creativity, community, and nature. Three themes that have become central to how she has spoken about her own recovery and that are increasingly woven through her public causes and her public messaging. At one of those engagements, she met a therapist who explained nonverbal approaches to healing using art, music, and movement, and she responded with a personal aside that George keeps her playful, that one of the children plays guitar and one plays drums, that the sense of joy and play that gets lost as adults comes back around children. It was a glimpse of her real, lived home life, offered without fanfare, and it landed with the particular warmth that genuine rather than manufactured personal disclosure always produces. The February visit to a London brewery where she declined to try beer and cider and said simply, "Since my diagnosis, I haven't had much alcohol. It's something I have to be a lot more conscious of now," was another of these moments. A small, honest, personal revelation that would have been unremarkable from almost anyone else, but that carried unusual weight coming from a woman whose public life has always been so carefully managed that any glimpse of the genuinely personal feels like a gift rather than a given. Kate has been offering these glimpses more freely and more often since her return, and the cumulative effect of them across months of public appearances is a public figure who feels more fully herself than perhaps she did before. Her own description of the experience, offered at a visit to Colchester Hospital's Cancer Wellbeing Center in 2025, was unusually direct. "It's life-changing for anyone," she said. Through first diagnosis or post-treatment and things like that, it is a life-changing experience, both for the patient but also for the families as well. She was speaking ostensibly about the experience of cancer generally, but the specificity of the language, the acknowledgement of the families as well, the quiet personal weight behind it, made clear she was also speaking from direct, recent, lived knowledge. Then came the Italy trip in May of this year, and this is the moment that royal commentators have widely identified as the true, definitive marker of how far her return has come and what it now genuinely looks like. The significance of it was layered on multiple levels. It was her first international trip since December of 2022, more than 3.5 years earlier, when she and William went to Boston for the Earthshot Prize ceremony. That gap, across which a cancer diagnosis, a year of chemotherapy, and a gradual, careful recovery had all unfolded, made the return to overseas travel something considerably more symbolically charged than a routine royal tour. It was also a solo working trip, undertaken without William, which in its own quiet way underlined that this was Kate in her own right, representing her own causes and her own institutional identity, rather than simply the Princess of Wales fulfilling a supporting role alongside her husband. And the cause she chose for this particular milestone, early childhood development, the Reggio Emilia approach, and its philosophy that children have an innate capacity for self-directed learning when given nurturing, nature-connected, loving environments, was entirely characteristic of the intellectual and philanthropic direction she has been developing for years through her Royal Foundation Center for Early Childhood. She visited a preschool in Reggio Emilia, on the outskirts of the city. She met educators, parents, children, and community leaders. She sat on floors and listened to teachers and played with small children who didn't know to be impressed, and who consequently just got on with treating her as another adult who was interested in them, which is entirely how she prefers it. She described the trip as special on Instagram. Kensington Palace said she was very much looking forward to visiting and to seeing firsthand how the approach creates environments where nature and loving human relationships come together to support children's development. And those photographs, the pale yellow dress, the genuine, unposed smile, the quality of full and unguarded presence that only people who are genuinely doing something they believe in tend to produce, circulated around the world with the particular speed and warmth that Kate's best public moments have always generated. The Daily Telegraph's welcome back Princess headline from several months earlier had been the institutional acknowledgement. The Italy photographs were something more personal. They were the visible, unambiguous evidence that the comeback wasn't just real, but whole. Throughout all of this, the Mother Nature film series that she launched in 2025 has provided a kind of creative and philosophical through-line for understanding how Kate has processed and begun to articulate what the experience of her illness and recovery has actually meant to her. The films, which she described as a deeply personal, creative reflection on the healing power of nature, were released across the year in a format quite unlike anything a senior royal has produced before. Not formal addresses, not policy statements, not even the kind of personal video message, direct to camera, carefully scripted and precisely timed, that had become her signature mode of personal communication during her illness. These were something more artistic, more intimate, more genuinely reflective of a woman who has always had a deep relationship with the outdoors, and who appears to have found, during the particular stripped-back clarity that serious illness tends to create, that nature was one of the things that sustained and comforted her most reliably. On her 44th birthday in January of this year, she released the final film in the series, and the words she chose for it were noted by everyone who covered it as unusually personal and unusually poetic for a royal communication. "I find myself reflecting on how deeply grateful I am," she said, "for the rivers within us flow with ease, fears washed away, cleanse and purify. Come to peace with our tears and discover what it means to be alive." These are not the words of a woman simply recovering from a difficult medical experience and looking forward to getting back to normal. These are the words of someone who has been through something genuinely profound and who is still, actively and with evident intention, working out what it has changed in them. Royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith made an observation that gets at something important about why all of this has resonated as deeply as it has. She noted that Kate has been very good at managing expectations, and that her selective engagements heighten their impact. That's true in a technical communications strategy sense, but it's also true in a more human sense. The selectivity, the pacing, the refusal to simply return to the old volume and velocity of public life as though the illness were simply an interruption to be put behind her as quickly as possible, has given each public appearance since the return a quality of presence and intention that makes them feel genuinely meaningful rather than simply scheduled. When she shows up somewhere now, it feels chosen. It feels like she's there because she specifically wanted to be there, and because she believes the cause or the community she's visiting matters, rather than because the diary said so. And the public response to that quality has been, by every measure available, extraordinary. The warmth with which she is greeted at public engagements, the speed with which tickets sell out for events she attends, the depth and volume of the public reaction to her Italy photographs, the consistent polling that shows her as by far the most admired and most trusted member of the working royal family. All of it points toward a public figure whose illness and return have, somehow, deepened the connection she already had with the public rather than diminishing it. What Kate Middleton's return has ultimately demonstrated across all these months and milestones is something that the British monarchy as an institution has probably needed, demonstrated more than it has needed almost anything else at this particular moment in its history. It has demonstrated that the human beings at the center of it can face something genuinely frightening and genuinely hard. Face it openly rather than behind the old wall of institutional silence and managed distance. Face it while the cameras are still watching and the institution still needs them, and the public is still paying close and sometimes uncomfortably intense attention, and come through it not diminished, but in some ways more fully themselves than before. That is not a small thing. In a moment when the monarchy has faced accumulated pressures and accumulated criticisms and accumulated questions about whether it still knows what it's for, the sight of its most beloved member walking into a preschool in northern Italy, sitting on the floor with children and smiling a smile that nobody arranged, is a reminder of what the institution looks like when it's working properly, when it's real, when the people at the center of it are genuinely connected to the purpose they're supposed to embody. Kate Middleton's return has been stunning, as the headline says, but the reason it's been stunning isn't really about glamour or fashion or celebrity, though all of those elements are present. It's stunning because it's genuine. And genuine right now may be the most powerful thing the monarchy has going for it.